residents in the area, Davidson County, Nashville, about regional transit. Also have representing planning and zoning, Councilman Fabian Bednay with us. Mr. Bland, you have the floor.
Not sure if this is, we on now, live? Appreciate the opportunity to give council a bit of an update on the nMotion process. We're not here tonight for you to anticipate any immediate action on the plan, but knowing frankly that a lot of members are new to council and maybe not as familiar with some of the history of this project, we wanted to bring you up to speed and open up the opportunity for discussion. First, I'd like to acknowledge Marion Ott, the chair of the MTA board, is here this evening and available for comment. Also, a lot of the project partners, in part of the presentation, we'll cover a lot of the players in this process, but I also want to acknowledge the presence of Mark Sturdivant, the Mayor's Director of Infrastructure, here this evening, Joanne Graves and Carrie Brumfield from the Transit Alliance of Middle Tennessee, who are active in the process, Michael Skipper and Michelle Lacewell from the Nashville area MPO, other key transportation planning partners, Bridget Jones from Cumberland Region Tomorrow, who's working with us on particularly the regional collaboration, and Laura Moore from the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce. They're heading up the Moving Forward advocacy effort. I thought what I would do is, in terms of outline, give you a little bit of history leading up to the current process that we're engaging in, give you a bit of a backdrop. You've seen an awful lot of media attention, public attention to the issue of regional transportation, public transit. So give you a bit of that backdrop. We're doing extensive outreach in this plan, so we share with you what we're hearing so far from Nashvillians, and then talk about upcoming steps and anticipated council involvement, and really take any questions and feedback from you all along the way. First of all, back in 2009 was the last time the Metro Transit Authority updated its master plan, its service plan, and the outcome of that plan led to a lot of the innovations that we're seeing in our transit service today, including initiatives like the BRT light service that we currently have in the Charlotte, Murfreesboro, and Gallatin Road corridors that is now planned for Nolensville corridor as well, Music City Circuit, and a number of the other initiatives. So part of this effort really is to update the planning in that effort. Also, I think probably all of you are familiar with the work that was done in the Nashville Next comprehensive planning process for Nashville over the past 3 years, extensive community engagement as a direct outcome of that process. Transit specifically and certain transit improvements were identified by thousands of Nashvillians as being a priority. So one of the things we are doing is working off of, not recreating, but working off of a lot of the outcomes of Nashville Next. And finally, who can forget the AMP? There are probably some folks on our board who'd like to, but in the aftermath of the controversy generated around the AMP, frankly, we wanted to take advantage of that, of the attention that was being paid to get people engaged at an earlier stage in the process. That project had a number of particular concerns for specific neighborhood residents, but two of the overriding issues we heard was, number one, a need to engage the public earlier in the process before generating large-scale investments such as that project, and number two, to show how individual projects might fit into a larger whole. What does that system look like? So we can't promise you that the stuff that comes out of nMotion won't generate controversy. The issue is itself controversial. So whatever we do or don't do is likely to be controversial. But we do want to identify a lot of the issues up front. Touching on the Nashville Next piece, I know a lot of what we've heard is, hey, make sure you don't recreate a process. It was extensive, it was lengthy. So we are meaning to tie on to the end, take a lot of the themes that were picked up by Nashville Next and really try to operationalize it into specific operating plans, specific service plans, and specific projects. The map that you see on the slide in front of you is directly out of Nashville Next, which really identified, based on the data, that planning process looked like and the input of over 18,000 folks in the city as to what really the core services, the core focus corridors for transit should be going into the future. So our intent in nMotion is taking a lot of that work and work by organizations like the Nashville Area MPO and TDOT, and again, turning it more granular into specific operating plans and objectives. This slide sort of depicts, people say, well, who's all involved in the transportation, the transit space in Middle Tennessee? This is not an exhaustive sample. but it is a good grouping, not exhaustive, but a good grouping of the folks that who've been very much engaged in the process to date. TDOT clearly plays a major role, and they had hoped to be here this evening, but their Assistant Commissioner for Planning had a conflict. I mentioned the Nashville area MPO. The MPO is in the process of working on the next long-range plan for Middle Tennessee, which will be adopted early next year, and this is all very much as part of that process, as is their planning work in the nMotion process. Many of you may be familiar and seen attention to the Chamber of Commerce's Moving Forward initiative, which really is an effort along with what the Transit Alliance and folks like Cumberland Region Tomorrow are doing to educate the general public and the business community about the need and where we're headed. And you can see a number of the other agencies, organizations that we're working with in addition. So why is this a hot issue now? You can see some of the statistics from an earlier version of the Vital Signs report that's put out jointly by the Nashville Area MPO and the Nashville Area Regional Chamber of Commerce. Suffice to say, and all of us have seen, we've seen congestion grow, getting worse, emissions grow, getting worse, travel delay grow, getting worse. While Nashville certainly ranks in the top 20 in terms of congestion per capita and excess emissions and fuel consumption per capita, out of the top 100 metro areas, we rank 76th in transit ridership. So we absolutely see the potential to design a system that can be more responsive to people in the region. Beyond congestion, the other issue that we're dealing with, and one that we hope we don't lose sight of as a region as people pay attention to the length of commute, are issues of income and equity disparities. Of current riders on the MTA system, 2/3 indicate what would you do? The question we ask in surveys is, if you weren't riding transit for the trip that you're taking right now as you fill out this survey, how would you be making the trip? And fully 2/3 of the people who respond to that question say, I couldn't take the trip. I don't have another alternative. The other third generally saying, I would drive. I would take my car. So not lost in this issue is how do we improve services for people who are absolutely dependent on it? And of course, the regional context that the MPO works in on a day-to-day basis and TDOT, keeping in mind that 54% of the people in our region live and work in different counties. Residents of Davidson County every day leaving to go to adjoining counties, and residents of those counties obviously coming into work, particularly in downtown Nashville and some of the immediate other areas. This schematic that you have is an overview of our process, and the bus cleverly shows you where we are in that process. We've done an extensive amount of upfront engagement with the public, and there will be a lot more to come. We've done what I would call the 30,000-foot view with the public. We'd like to share with you what they've been telling us so far. But to date, we've had over what I would call 6,400 engagements, not necessarily individuals. It might be people attending a meeting or a public session, people participating in a chat, people responding to a survey. And our goal at the outset was to be well over 10,000, and we expect that to beat that pretty handily. As an example, we've engaged in 65 transit talks, generating over 1,000 in attendance. We have 5,300 current email subscribers to what's going on. Next steps in this process, as we continue the public engagement, we're particularly focused at the regional level at this moment in some of the outlying counties. We're also generating a series of scenarios, so taking a number of possible strategies that we might use to address the issues that are being identified, packaging them in a cohesive way, and then we expect to be going out for another round of pretty extensive public participation right after the first of the year. So one of the requests we have for any council member is, you know your districts better than anyone. If there are groups, individuals, entities that we should be talking to, conducting outreach with, we would really appreciate you letting us know who those are so we can schedule those. And also pointing people to the nmotion2015.org webpage. It's a pretty interactive page. There's a lot of information, a lot of reports, a lot of strategy papers. People can not only review, but they can comment extensively and give us their feedback in that manner. A document that we have in the handout based on a lot of the upfront engagement that we saw This document was adopted by both the MTA Board of Directors and the RTA Board of Directors as sort of a joint document to guide the design of principles of services and products moving forward. And you can see some of the specific principles that we're trying to adhere to as we advance those plans. So I guess a quiz you can give us as we move forward is, how closely do the alternatives we develop adhere to the principles that have been stated? And in terms of what we're hearing from Nashvillians, I would break it down into really three broad categories. Clearly, it's convenience, and when you drill down on that question for people, it comes down to how simple is it to use the system. So efforts like our pending real-time information applications will tie into that, as well as things like route simplicity. Span of service is another big one, the hours of service. Most of our key routes shut down by midnight. Frankly, this is very much a hospitality-based city, so we're hearing from a lot of employers and a lot of prospective employees that they would like to have broader trip options by time of day. Frequency of service is a key one. People would tend to ride it if it ran more often. And particularly out in the region, it's the directness of service and speed. A lot of our outlying folks say, hey, if you can make it competitive with my car, I will absolutely use it. Dependability becomes a big issue, and that's on-time performance. And that becomes more challenging with all of the other traffic dynamics we have, so we're working very closely with folks like Metro Public Works, TDOT, to figure out what we might do to make transit more reliable. The other is predictability of route and schedule, as we have an awful lot of downtown events and street closures and detours. It becomes more challenging for riders to know what their route is. And then finally, this, as this came out from the public, it concerned me a bit. Well, it concerned me a lot when we started to hear it, was the issue of safety. And when we probed on that issue, it was not so much the issue of I don't feel safe when I'm on a bus. It was the whole issue of pedestrian access to bus stops, having to cross major thoroughfares to get to bus stops or from bus service to a destination. So again, one, I think jointly working closely with Metro, with the Director of Infrastructure and Metro Public Works, with the city's upcoming sidewalk master plan to say how might we do a better job with that. And also particularly in certain locations, whether it be street lighting or, you know, the adjoining appearance of surroundings, perception of safety at specific bus stops and shelters. Coming quickly to next steps, first of all, you see a couple of the covers on reports that are on the nMotion2015.org website. We would certainly encourage any of you who have an interest, if you haven't already, to visit the website, to comment on reports. Also to let your constituents know that this information is available. I've really been struck, there are about probably 25 or 30 strategy papers that go into a fair amount of depth on various topics. That's interesting enough, but there are an awful lot of people reading them and submitting comments, and the comments are readable online, and we found those very interesting to review and go through. We will be continuing to engage with other Metro departments and related agencies. I see Mr. Harbison in the room. MDHA is one that we've been talking to quite extensively about how to connect the issues of transportation, transit, affordable housing, what have you. We would anticipate future briefings as we go through the process for council as a whole and specific council committees. And obviously, nothing in this world comes without some level of budget implication, so working collaboratively with council and the mayor's office, identifying what those priorities might be in the future for Metro as a city and for this council. With that, that kind of concludes the formal remarks. I would certainly, Mr. Chair, appreciate and encourage any questions or input into the process to date, and truly appreciate many members have spent time with us individually in the process so far, and would certainly encourage, if you do have an interest, that we'd be happy to meet with you one-on-one.
Thank you, Mr. Bland. I'd like to open up the floor for any questions. If anyone has one, please ask. Go ahead, Bob.
Thank you. First of all, thanks very much. The nMotion process, I think, is it's palpable how much energy is behind it, and unlike some other public planning processes, there seems to be a genuine feeling that all the solutions are on the table and the genuine feedback is being solicited, and everything you guys can do to reinforce that is the reality, I think would be awesome. I do congratulate you guys on running an open process that is, I think, doing a great job. My comment and sort of a question has to do with there's sort of an alphabet soup, MTA, RTA, MPO, there's the nMotion process, there's the chambers moving forward, I could go on. And I think I'm not alone. Even for those of us who are fairly well informed, it takes a great deal of effort to narrow it down to, if I want to be a cheerleader for regional transit and the process, who do I go to get the talking points? And I would say that I don't think I've really got it down to a person that I would go to. I think I would probably pick out 5 or 6 people in these overlapping organizations and have to interview them and hope to get to a common set of talking points. And I would encourage you guys as you move forward, and maybe there's a single point of contact now, but I would definitely encourage, for those of us who are out in the community who can and want to be cheerleaders for the process, I think it's hard for us to figure out what's the top 3 talking points right now.
Right. Well, no, I appreciate that comment. It's one we hear a lot, and we have a lot of the partner organizations are present in the room tonight. So at the at the discretion of the chair, if you would invite them to comment as well. I think one of the issues is there are definite areas of overlap among all of the organizations, the MPO, the MTA, the RTA, TDOT, and the continuing alphabet soup. And there are also things that we do uniquely and differently, and frankly, a specific area of focus of everyone from the chamber to the MPO to TDOT has been to try to make sure we improve communication on those areas of overlap. And I would say, it's still a work in progress. I know a huge priority for Mayor Barry and the creation of the infrastructure position was to make sure even within Metro those functions are working better together. So to say there's a single point of contact right now is probably a stretch, but we at least hope that people are repeating the same themes in the various forums and the various audiences. Perfect example is we also manage the services of the Regional Transportation Authority, the 10-county agency, so there is coordination there, but knowing up front, we don't have the reach in the outer counties, frankly, that others do. We engage in a partnership with the Transit Alliance of Middle Tennessee and Cumberland region tomorrow to get those counties into that conversation, and that's been very effective. So the hope is, as we work toward developing a plan, and the MPO works toward developing their plan, and TDOT works toward developing theirs, that those cohesive talking points start to emerge over the next 6 months or so.
From your perspective, for right now over these next 6 months as we're out in the community, from MTA's perspective, what are the 2 or 3 talking points that you would like to have us conveying?
Sure. First of all, one of the talking points is get engaged in a process. From a transit perspective, one of the things, frankly, Councilman, that we hear over and over again is, well, you should do this strategy or that strategy. And one of the things that I always tell people is you really need to come back to markets that, for instance, somebody might say, well, you need to do light rail, or you need to absolutely not do light rail. The question is, what are the characteristics of, before we go to a specific project, what are the characteristics of service that kind of going back to, what the public was saying, to what extent can whatever we do, whether it's a service or a project, meet those needs? So I think one of the talking points is if we can identify what the public needs to use it more and then deliver it, then we'll be successful. And coming back to that, I think, would be a key theme.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Councilman Sledge, got a question?
Yes. In fact, I got 2 questions, if you don't mind. The first is, you mentioned briefly about the expansion of BRT Light to Nolensville Pike, which is coming. How are you incorporating that expansion into nMotion?
Right.
I know obviously there are meetings that are going to be held, but how are those tied into, I guess, the larger planning process?
Sure. There are a couple parallel processes. The Nolensville BRT Light expansion is one where actually we'll be doing public outreach in the corridor and with a current rider base specifically on that service out over the next 2 to 3 weeks. It'll be wrapped into nMotion. nMotion is really looking at a broader, what that system-wide perspective looks. So for instance, we might take a look at a corridor like Nolensville Pike and say, BRT Light as currently designed gets us this far. What the public is saying, what the region needs is for us to go further and look at some specific strategies and options and revisit those with the public, both frankly short-term and long-term, over a period of time. So the nMotion process, as well as the MPO long-range plan, recognizes that while you're doing all of this long-range visioning and planning, there are still systems to run and service improvements to be made, so that we like to wrap the ongoing improvements in and then fit those into a longer range plan to see what that next step might be.
And my second question ties in somewhat to nMotion, but I'm just asking for a status update on the tracking app, the mobile app that we've talked about for a while.
I was concerned that with Chair Allen not in the room, this question might not get asked, but we're doing a soft launch of the real-time app. The operating, what I'll call branding around it, is Music City Transit Tracker, and that's lumping around the variety. It's the real-time app on your smartphone, it's the digital signs that will have real-time information, it's the call-in capability in the web-based. The data will begin being released. We have it in beta test now, and it's working very well. I have it on my phone and can attest to that. It's pretty neat when you're using it. We expect that data to be released in the open data architecture platform by mid-December. And some of the software developers that the app developers we've been working with so far will have it available immediately. A couple others, for instance, we're partnering with Vanderbilt on their T-Hub application. That may happen after the first of the year. Then we expect to do kind of a hard push marketing-wise with it not long after the first of the year.
Our next question, Councilman Elrod.
Thank you, Chairman. I also have two questions. The first one, I guess, is a comment and a question. I want to commend MTA and all of your staff for all the outreach that you've done here in Nashville, the community meetings, the surveys. I don't think anybody in Nashville, to be honest, has an excuse not to be a part of this process. And I think it's incumbent upon anyone that has an interest in transit to go to a community meeting, to fill out one of your many surveys, read one of your many white papers that are on your website, and to submit comments. I want to commend you and your staff on that. But part of that, I think, and you touched on it, I think, a few minutes ago, was to reach out to the 9 counties surrounding us. And can you touch a little bit on that? Because I think you and I have talked about, and you've talked about, any kind of solution to transit is going to be a regional one. And I know it's more difficult to get into some of those counties for y'all and maybe for transit in Middle Tennessee. Some of that reach out to the communities, but at least to the county mayors, the city mayors, city councils, and county commissions. Could you touch on that, how that's going?
Yeah, actually, it's going incredibly well. I'm thankful, and I'm glad they're here tonight for the partnership with Cumberland Region tomorrow and the Transit Alliance. We're in the midst of a series of outreach sessions in the 9 surrounding counties. We're about halfway through, and we've been averaging anywhere from 80 to 140 folks in the sessions, and a lot of it is community leadership. There are members of the general public, but it's city council people and mayors, county council members. And to some extent, there's even greater interest in a lot of the outlying counties because, frankly, from a time of commute standpoint, they're feeling the pain a lot more than folks in Nashville are. And that's something that we hear resoundingly, particularly in areas like Rutherford County and Sumner County. We were just in Sumner County the other night. And very much what we're hearing from them is, A, there's an interest in partnering regionally. They recognize that it isn't their issue alone. B, their focus does tend to be the Nashville connection. The session we had in Robertson County, the folks up there acknowledged, look, good part of the future of our county and the economic success of our county depends on a good, strong connection to the Nashville core. And I think you're also seeing that manifest in the work that the MPO has been doing, and the MPO and leading, the efforts of the Mayor's Caucus in sort of rallying around mobility, as a core regional issue. So I'm actually, pretty optimistic about the ability to, again, there will be controversy around what's presented in specific individual proposals, but there hasn't been any controversy to date that it's A, a regional issue, and B, one that everybody has an interest in.
Good. My second question is on one of your last slides that has the timeline, and you talk, at the end of the process, it sounds like I read that there's going to be there it is. The recommendations that will happen or improvements that will happen long-term, short-term, and implementation strategies. Is nMotion going to have this is our recommendation to Nashville, Davidson County, into the Middle Tennessee area, or are there going to be varying levels of solutions with varying levels of, I think, as you said, budget implications for Nashville and surrounding counties?
Right. Coming back to the different, as we said earlier, the alphabet soup of agencies, frankly, a lot of the things that we'll come up with as recommendations, I would expect probably don't necessarily hit the radar of, say, the MPO's long-range plan, because they're lower dollar, shorter term, what I'll call the low-hanging fruit. And a great example, I mean, it's one that's in planning now, is the real-time app, but there'll be operational improvements. Could very well be, you saw on the slide of stakeholders, the logos of the taxi companies and Lyft and Uber, so they may very well be, well, how do we use technology to better integrate the various modes to make seamless trips and to give us better outreach, better reach into neighborhoods where maybe it's not cost effective to run traditional transit service, but we want to be able to feed that. So I would expect, based on a lot of the things that are being developed, you're going to see a real mix of solutions, some that can be implemented very quickly, frankly, for no money. Some that may be very long-term, and require an awful lot of attention. And frankly, some that are going to have to be in cooperation with other entities, like the MPO, but also, as an example, if we want to do a major transit upgrade in a corridor, let's say like Nolensville Pike, we really are going to have to focus on the pedestrian access issues to make sure that we get maximum leverage out of the investment. So I think you'll see a real series of those coming out.
Our next question, Councilman O'Connell.
I have a handful, so if people get tired of me, just let me know and I can cede the floor for a bit. First of all, I'd like to thank Chairman Potts as well as Chair Allen, even though in her absence, for putting together this session. It's extremely valuable. And Steve, thanks so much to you and staff and board members for being present for this as well. Starting from the data and fiscal side, even more so, I think, than routes, modes, and how it's going to look. Are we expecting that this plan will make available to the public in an easily digested way? I mean, focusing in on that, hey, we're 76th in terms of ridership kind of scenario, and looking at the picture, for instance, of $36 million operating budget from Metro, and that share of what the Metro operating budget is. Will we get to see that kind of spread out against what our options are there in terms of, status quo, what it would look like if we had dedicated revenues on different scales and scopes and that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's the intent. We're still kind of going back and forth on the formatting. When I talk about the three scenarios, the intent is not that we'll pick A, B, or C. The intent is, here are sort of cohesive approaches. What do you like from this one? What do you like from that one? What do you like from this one? And then package that around order of magnitude of cost. And, at the very highest end of achieving, large mobility goals, that gets really expensive over time. And probably we look at breaking down, on a per capita basis. So what we're trying to work toward now is how to frame that story, how to avoid the 300 pages of numbers and charts that people get lost in, and to put it more in a story format of, hey, here's what this relative level of spending buys you, in terms of mobility, out longer range. So frankly, that's one of the things we are challenged by. And there are an awful lot of communications professionals in this chamber that we're interested in any and all advice we can get on how you tell that story. But one of the more interesting reports on the webpage, for people who haven't been there, is the State of the MTA System report. So it gives pretty good diagnostics about where we are today as a system in a city. And it also does some benchmarking, so you can get a relative, if you say, boy, I rode the system in Denver and I really loved it, well, you'll be able to benchmark, well, Denver's spending this per capita relative to Nashville.
And will that peer city information also be a part of the final plan for this process?
I'm honestly not sure what format that will take yet. It will certainly be accessible. The intent is not to, here's our final plan and we rip down all the historical artifacts. To be frank, until we start seeing what it looks like and saying, boy, that just doesn't look digestible, I guess. To the point earlier, we want to make this as accessible to the general public as possible. We want to make sure that you don't need a master's degree in traffic engineering or a doctorate in transit planning to be able to understand it. So to be frank, that's what we'll struggle with, is how do we present things and information, not dumbing it down, but making sure that okay, yeah, I get it for that amount. And the cities we've looked at that have been most successful in getting through this, that's exactly what they've been able to do, is make this a very human process and a human plan.
Well, and then sort of following up on Councilman Elrod's questions, if we think through what's possible now or in the near term, in addition to looking at high capacity options, looking at regional options, are we going to have the opportunity in examining this plan to think about flexible system design? I know there's been talk of distributed networks. I think, for instance, mobility in the urban core presents its own set of challenges that are distinct from regional challenges.
Right. Yeah, as part of the process, we're having really, I think, exciting conversation. And we talk about the big ideas. A lot of people think about the big dollar, long-term capital projects, but I think some of the excitement is what the technology offers in terms of tying things together seamlessly. For instance, the conversations with Vanderbilt, okay, with real-time transit information, how do you integrate that with real-time traffic information and real-time parking information so that a person can just say, I don't know transit, I don't know how to drive there, I don't know where to park, but I want to go from A to B. What are my options based on my criteria? We're working with the rideshare providers, and how do we as a transit agency, so if a limitation of, say, a Lyft or an Uber or a taxi is, well, I don't have access to the credit card or the account, do we set opportunities through us to get folks who don't have that type of access to a more appropriate service? So I think there's a lot of really interesting and exciting things that Nashville has available to it, technologies that when Denver or Dallas or some of the cities that are further along, when they were planning their systems, didn't have access to. They're pretty exciting and not necessarily $1 billion.
Well, and you mentioned storytelling and ideas, and I wonder also, will the plan make available some of the ideas that members of the public have presented, that you all as a staff and authority have presented, that the planning consultants who are working with you? I mean, I think I keep hearing in my district in particular where we are building at a rate, and we might have some roadway and other, sidewalk, cyclist, motorist infrastructure, but there's no connection at all to transit seats. And I'm thinking through things like, okay, Easy Ride, if we tied, some kind of incentive to get people more on board with Easy Ride, those kinds of things. Will ideas like that be expressed in some way? Yeah,
that is certainly the intent. It's, again, the challenge, and why I'm being very evasive about the format of the report, is how we're able to put everything in a digestible format. I think the other neat thing going on right now, with all the attention that both the general public, but frankly a lot of the institutional interests, whether it be business, educational, what have you, is, in all of these forums that are taking place, that can be pretty daunting because everybody's got, is moving forward in the MPO process, what have you, is a lot of those conversations coming from people who frankly hadn't historically been in the transit conversations. So when they start saying the what ifs, it's, hey, wait a minute, why not? Why not consider some of those things and looking at what those new partnerships might be? So, frankly, in addition to the alphabet soup we have now, it takes all hands on deck to address the issue. So I kind of hope that's what materializes. But I spend time just about every Friday going to the project website and reading the comments, and I never have enough time to read as much as I want to, and I'm constantly blown away by, frankly, the level of understanding. Or people, we have so many new folks in Nashville, both other places in the U.S. or internationally, that say, well, yeah, okay, that sounds interesting, but what about this thing that I rode, in San Francisco or in South America? And again, a lot of it isn't necessarily the huge dollar. It's kind of simple things that pique my curiosity.
One last question is, will we also get a sense of infrastructure needs for modes that are available to us now? I mean, you've mentioned the bus rapid transit, the lightweight form, BRT Light, a few times. My understanding is traffic signal priority is not fully implemented across all of those routes,
Right.
will we get a sense of what it takes
Yeah.
to do the different gradations of modes?
Yeah, one thing I would expect that you'll see is when we talk about a particular transit improvement, we'll also talk about precursors to success, and that could be the development trends, land use intensity. You saw a fair amount of that in the Nashville Next documentation relative to transit. And the other things will be, here are the partnerships that could be necessary. So it's keeping in mind that the MTA has, a role in mobility, but it's not exclusive, and all of this stuff has to work together, whether it's traffic signal, adaptive traffic signals, or, lane treatments or what have you. And toward that end, we've been really encouraged over probably specifically the last 6 months about the conversations we're having at the tactical level with TDOT, in the regional corridors about what might be done to, increase carrying capacity. So I think you're going to see a fair amount of that, and probably calling out specifically, here are the entities that really need to be involved in this, and here's what we need to achieve. And again, what I believe we'll come back to, is that, okay, how does all this tie to what Nashvillians are telling us they need to make better use of the system?
Next question is Council Lady Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, Director Bland. My question is, you mentioned at the survey about 67% of the participant is dependable rider. Are they participating in this program? Sometimes those dependable rider may not have internet access either.
Right.
So, but I think capture their needs will be most important to make this program more successful.
Yep. That's absolutely our intent, and the surveys that have been available online, we've also administered on board and at Music City Central, what have you. Frankly, I would be the first to tell you that with some folks, it's tough to get them engaged. So, when you're, hey, I'm just trying to get to work, leave me alone, it's tough to get that input. One of the things we're doing now after the first large wave of public engagement is frankly identifying the gaps and trying to, for lack of a better word, overcompensate in future rounds. So if we see, say, a particular zip code that's underrepresented or a particular socioeconomic or demographic group that's underrepresented, we're going to bend over backwards to try to make sure that they're accounted for throughout the course. It's been pretty wide representation, but there are certainly pockets where we look and we say, we really need to get more participation in those groups. And again, knowing that you all know your districts and your constituencies much better than we do, if there are specific groups or organizations or churches that you think we could really leverage to get that word out, we would truly appreciate it.
Next question is Councilman Coleman. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chairman Potts. Thank you, Steve, for coming out. I think this information has really been helpful. You mentioned that there were 9 surrounding counties. I didn't get that. Maybe you mentioned it, but if you can.
Sure.
Then after you click off that, I know this is not a budget issue right now, but it generally comes back to budget somewhere, somehow. So my question is, how are the surrounding counties anticipated contributing to
Sure.
the funding of some of the plans that you're discussing today?
Right. The participation of the surrounding counties, and I specifically, at another point in time, I could do more on the RTA side of the equation. They're specifically participating through the RTA piece of the process. So nMotion is sort of, if you can imagine, 2 trains going down a parallel track, and then there are crossovers. So there's an MTA piece, there's an RTA piece, and then there'd be what I would call an integration piece on how do these systems work together. Because frankly, that's another thing the outer counties recognized was, hey, the RTA might be able to get my folks into downtown Nashville. Once they get there, they're going to need to get somewhere, so it needs to be connected on the MTA system. So that financial participation in the planning process is largely through the RTA budgeted piece, which ran parallel with MTA. So that's their financial engagement to date. In the broader array of service, and what the RTA does, essentially it's broken down if you take a service, say the 9 commuter bus routes and the Music City Star, we take out passenger fares, other operating income, we take away the available federal and state sources, and then essentially the affected municipalities in a corridor share in that expense. And it's frankly one of the reasons I'm glad that and I suspect that the Mayor's Caucus has taken up dedicated funding for mass transit as a key issue, is every year the 38-member RTA board has to argue about those allocations, and it gets pretty interesting. But to date, everybody sort of stepped up. The 9 surrounding counties that are involved, they include the MPO counties, but a few extras. They are Rutherford, Williamson, Wilson, Sumner, Cheatham. I knew I would get this test. Montgomery, Dixon, Murray. I'm getting close. Robertson, correct, and I'm missing one. Oh, Davidson would be the 10th, so that would be the 9 plus the 10. So some are a lot are in the MPO boundaries. Montgomery obviously is in the Clarksville MPO, and then we have a couple of rural planning organization counties.
Our next question, Councilman Sledge.
Yeah, I had a couple more. Just based on what the mayor had mentioned today about putting additional revenue in for sidewalks and paving, how do you envision taking the feedback you've gotten now, plus what you already know about the system about creating that access to transit stops, to kind of incorporate that now versus the end of this process?
Right. Well, absolutely. It's our understanding Metro will be updating the sidewalk master plan over the course of the next year. And I've also heard from both the mayor and Mr. Sturdivant that transit, in addition to things like access to schools, will be a hot issue. And one of the things we encourage in that realm is, we tend to, when we're planning or looking at the big picture, we're taking 30,000-foot views. So we're looking at these big regional maps and where population density and job density are. And I would encourage, and a council member could do it, as can I, as can, Mark Macy in Public Works. Let's take the 2-foot view and what is the experience of that person, in a neighborhood. And I know I ride the system very frequently. I'm fortunate I live in a very walkable neighborhood. But when you're riding a route like Gallatin Road or Nolensville Pike and you watch people who truly depend on the system get off that bus and try to figure out, well, I could go up to the safe place to cross, but that's about a half-a-mile walk, and then I'm still going to go across 6 lanes of traffic. Really kind of look at it from the user's perspective. And then particularly persons with disabilities or senior citizens. One of the things we were really struck by in the numbers is, compared to a typical transit agency, and particularly given the demographics of Nashville, we're really underrepresented in senior ridership on our fixed route system. We have a large number who ride the access ride system. And when we talk to those folks, largely it is that issue. Yeah, I'm not afraid to be on your bus. It's a real challenge for me to get to your bus. So, I think any of those looking at that 2-foot view of, okay, how am I actually navigating the system is really key. If I have to go walk, cross 6 lanes of traffic and walk with no sidewalks and kind of stand in a drainage ditch to wait for the bus, boy, that you really have to need that service pretty badly to go after it.
And your point about senior citizens and those with disabilities actually leads to my other question. Was it says in the sustainability guiding principle about improving that accessibility of fixed route services. How do you see improving that accessibility interacting with the current access ride program? Does it supplement? Right. Does it replace? Is it some sort of mix?
Ultimately, I think in the cities that do it well, they say the ultimate goal is to make the fixed route system, whether it's bus or rail, as accessible as possible to seniors, persons with disabilities, so that access ride type service is really freed up for the folks who absolutely need it. If you talk to a lot of our access ride customers, they would love to be using fixed route service, but maybe they're in a wheelchair and there are no curb cuts, or there are no, really it's difficult to access that service, but they would love to be able to do that, and then because access ride is on a per trip basis very costly to provide just by the nature of the service, when you can free up that resource, to give better service to people who absolutely need it, it's kind of a win-win across the board. So I think, and the end strategic plan, I mean, a lot of the focus has been on the issues relative to regional, or how do you get more people using fixed route system, or what technologies are out there. But there will absolutely be a component of, well, A, what do we do to make access ride better and more responsive to the needs of that customer base? And B, how might we use them to work together, work more interactively? I mentioned taxis and Lyft and Uber and all of those modes, but I would also put the access ride system into that, into that bunch too. Okay, how do we have the two kind of work together a little bit? And again, there are models in other cities where that's being done pretty regularly, particularly in outlying areas. Maybe not as much in the downtown core, but in some of the outlying areas of the county, like Madison or Antioch, where that could be a pretty effective bridge to get folks to service.
We have another question, Councilman O'Connell.
I forgot at the end of one of my questions to ask this too. And in the storytelling portion of this plan, will we kind of get comprehensive mobility coverage in the sense of, all right, we'll look at costs of transit-related infrastructure in addition to just traditional roadway infrastructure?
Yeah, the thing I would say on costs in this particular plan is they are definitely, where I'm saying, look at the 2-foot view for access. These are going to be at the 30,000-foot view. So, you may not be able to, we won't be able to at this point say, well, to do all of this stuff is going to be down to the penny. But it'll be range of magnitude. Well, if you're looking for this range of improvement in a particular corridor that would include, pedestrian, bike ped access, streetscape improvements, and some level of transit improvement using benchmark numbers, it should cost X per mile. The corridor's about that many miles, so here's a order of magnitude. The peril in that is invariably when you go after a project 10 years down the road, the reporting is always, well, back 10 years ago, they said it was going to be this. So I just want to make sure folks, when they see that, understand that those will likely be order of magnitude costs, as opposed to, and really more for comparative purposes. So when you're looking at option A, B, C, well, we can have this, or this, that folks, when they're rendering their opinions and their judgments, can take that relative magnitude of cost into consideration. Right. Yeah, I'm sure we can put some benchmarks to that in consultation with TDOT. And frankly, a lot of the conversations we've had with TDOT about transit capacity have been, well, gee, it might be tough to retrofit a transit facility onto this structure or this particular facility, but if we're going to have to do some major reconstruction of a lot of that right-of-way into the future, we should be thinking about that capacity, and I know that's something that's being anticipated in the MPO's long-range plan.
Our next question, Councilman Elrod.
Just real quick, thank you you touched on the Nolensville Road BRT. When do you anticipate that being ready for riders?
It would definitely be by the middle of next year. I'll be completely honest in saying what we're grappling with. As many of you probably seen, we've started the electric buses in operation on the Music City circuit. We currently have one charging station at Riverfront Station, and when they shut down that station, we don't have access to it. So we're in the process of putting another one on the north end near the ballpark. So we would be introducing concurrent with that. So hopefully it'll be spring, maybe summer of 2016.
Well, that's all the questions I have in the queue. Thank you, Mr. Bland, for this great meeting, and thank you, everybody, for the great questions. It was wonderful.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chair.
y'all.